This is Mara and Ben for Stellar Strategy Gaming. Today we're going to be talking about two of the most iconic and, in my opinion, best and most underdeveloped playable races in 5e. Those are the half-orc and the half-elf. And sometimes you really just can't beat the classics.
Yes, now the half-orc and half-elf, as mentioned, are some of the original D&D races, and as such, even throughout all 5 editions, their stat blocks have remained relatively speaking the same, with only a few minor mechanical changes, with the exception of 4th, which no one played. So, with the half-elf and half-orc, they both have some very interesting stats. However, I feel like they need more overall. There isn't enough to really sink your teeth into as a player. The problem that I'm having really is that we have 24 different flavors of elf, and yet there is only one type of half-elf. I mean, are you saying that a drow half-elf is no different from a high half-elf? Because I feel like there would be some pretty major stat differences or magical capability differences. Like, there would be a lot going on there. And even with the orcs, there are definitely a lot of different ways that being a half-orc can manifest, especially given how close they are with some other races as well. So it could be more than just half-orc, half-human. So definitely more variants are needed.
Yes, and with the orcs especially, one of the things that's really interesting about orc culture as it's portrayed in the lore, orcs are one of the few races that don't look down upon mixed-race marriages. As a matter of fact, in the lore, it describes half-orcs often rising to positions of power and authority. Ogrelons, which are orcs with ogre heritage, I've also heard the term orog, tend to rise to leadership roles in their tribes because of their physical size and strength. Orcs that are half-human tend to rise to roles of leadership because while orcs don't have sunlight sensitivity, in the lore they're often described as not liking sunlight, so the half-human, half-orcs are more comfortable operating in different areas. Also, orcs do occasionally mate with goblins, and that would be a great setup for something like a half-orc rogue. The list of possibilities goes on and on. One of the best characters I've played, one of the most fun characters, was a half-orc paladin named Edom, and for flavor purposes, I made him an ogrelon. He had ogre heritage, so he was this huge, boisterous, extra orc, like more orcish than most orcs orc. So it really brought out the fun of the character.
Yes, and something else that's really interesting about these guys is that they're both caught between worlds, really. With the orcs, obviously, they're caught between the world of orcs and whatever their other half is, and with elf, they're caught between elves and usually humans. And especially with half-elves, I could really see a lot of potential here, given the elves don't have the same, I guess, progressiveness with their interracial marriages. If you think about it, a half-elf who lives in a society of elves would have the issue of not really being seen much at all as an adult, just because of how short their lifespans are by comparison to an elf. They barely reach like a quarter of the lifespan of an elf, if I remember correctly, whereas if they lived in a human village, they might be viewed with suspicion or fear because they're going to outlive the tribal elders or whatever it is. And with half-orcs, they have the interesting problems of the fact that because the orcs are very religious and godly people, in the sense that they follow their god Grummish very closely, they might have the issue that they have to ignore some spiritual guidance, or conversely, they might embrace it a little too much, which might get them to become outcasts in other societies that aren't quite so religious.
And there's a lot of flavor options with these guys. With the half-elf, some questions come to mind, like what's a relationship between a half-elf and their elf parent is like. An elf lives to be about 700 years old, whereas the half-elves don't live anywhere near that. So you have the position of an elf could be, say, 200 years old, have a child, and know that they're going to outlive that child. They will watch their child grow old and die if they maintain the relationship. So what is that relationship like? It seems to be pretty well established in the lore that half-orcs can have kids. It's not established so much if half elves could have kids. That leads itself to a lot of possibilities as far as role play. You could have a half-elf who can't have kids with elves or humans, who's looking for some sort of magic that would allow it to happen. You could have, if you wanted to play just a stereotypical bard, because elves or half-elves do get the charisma buff, you could have it be a situation where maybe they didn't think they could have kids, and then they went and, oops, I got a nobleman's daughter pregnant. I need to make a hasty flight away from wherever I'm from. Or my personal favorite is the half-elf bard who spends 50 years wandering the countryside and discovers that they've fathered a child or two per year for all of that time, and now they need to go steal a dragon's hoard to make their back child support payments. I mean, I know it's kind of goofy, but hey, let's have fun with it. There's so much there. There's so much there to play with and enjoy.
Yes, and now something else that's also pretty interesting is a lot of people would say, oh, well, why couldn't a half-elf necessarily have a child? And I will say that the lore does actually specify that elves not only aren't one of the most fertile species, but they actually have a limited number of souls, literally. The only time when an elf has a child is when another elf dies. One could argue that this should mean that elves are extinct, but to avoid getting a bit pedantic about the lore, it can provide some interesting moral conundrums for the character as well. What if perhaps they were a human in a past life, but then got reincarnated into an elf? What would that mean for the elven civilization they now live in? Or conversely, what if an elf soul ends up in a half-human? What does that mean for them? So there's definitely a lot of really interesting ways you could go with that.
Yes, in the lore with the dwarves, it does specify that only full dwarves can have a dwarven soul, so half-dwarves do exist, but they're essentially cut off from the dwarven community, from the worship of Moradin, Dumathoin, and Clangeddin. I don't know that it is necessarily covered, and you could certainly homebrew it to your heart's content of how half-elves view these half-breeds. Do they view these as people with souls? Right now, in our world, there are people who believe that people of certain religious and ethnic groups have horns and are demonic in nature. And in a magical world, in a genuinely magical world, how does that look? How does that feed into the superstitions, the prejudice, etc., and so forth? Now, if you look at our half-elf stat block, they get a charisma buff of 2, 2 other ability scores of your choice by 1. They live to be more than 180 years old, even though they're adults by the time they're 20. Some of their size and speed is pretty standard. They get dark vision, which is great. Skill versatility is an underrated part of the class. You get proficiency in 2 skills of your choice, so it's not tied to anything the way class proficiencies are. You can read, write, speak Common, Elvish, and 1 extra language of your choice. Again, that's a big deal, the fact that it's of your choice. Now, they have the ability of Fey Ancestry, which gives them advantage on saving throws against being charmed. Magic can't put them to sleep. That can be incredibly powerful. I was in a party that accidentally broke an encounter one time because the DM started off with hitting us with a high-level sleep spell, and he failed to take into account that the party included 2 half-elves and 1 full elf. And I think it was a party of 4 or 5 people, so it just barely mattered, where it was supposed to be a big deal that the battle was starting with most of the party asleep. The obvious choices for something with the buffs that the half-elf gets would be something like a bard, a warlock. I could actually see that being a really interesting path. Maybe a half-elf takes Pact of the Fae in order to get closer to their Fae ancestry, or maybe they've been cast out by their elven community and they're making literally deals with the devil on a quest for revenge. You could go all kinds of ways with that. If they're half Shatterkai, then they would be a great Hexblade, and naturally Paladin would also be an obvious choice. Something I occasionally do, which I know is not necessarily viewed well by much of the community, is a lot of times I'll take whatever the bonus is as a dump stat, so I just don't get a negative on anything. Whatever the opposite of min-maxing is, it's that. I had a lot of fun with a half-elf monk. It was really against type, and it was really a good time playing that character. So you've got just tremendous versatility and options with the class and type of character you want to play.
Yes, and before I move on to the orc stat block, I would like to say that another very fun thing you could do is play a paladin warlock multiclass, which immediately sounds cringy just because of how overpowered both classes are, but not getting into that and just focusing on the lore and the fun of RP for a second. One of the interesting things you can really do is that a lot of gods, especially Feywild gods, tend to have 2 or more aspects to them. And I'm going to use a real-life example of this, which is Demeter from Greek mythology. One side of her is the god of nature and life, and the other side is the god of blight and death, just because of the fact that that is her domain. And so with Corellon, one side of her is very generous and gives all these elves these magical abilities, and the other side took away their ability to shape change entirely in the lore. So you could have a paladin of Corellon, who's a paladin of the bright side of Corellon, and then a warlock of Corellon, who's the side that took away those magical abilities, who perhaps focuses on neutering other people's magical abilities.
In my eternal quest to recreate John Constantine in this game, that sounds like as good a way as any to do it. Now, you said you wanted to go into the half-orc stats?
Yes. No, the half-orcs, their stats aren't... I would say that they're not the most powerful in the book. However, they're definitely up there. The ones that really matter to me is, first off, the strength score increases by 2, which means that you can play nearly anything with it, I think, just because a lot of classes have the issue where their strength score becomes a dump stat. Even Hexblade Warlocks, they depend on charisma more than anything. However, that +2 means that your dump stat could actually be getting a +1, which could be something which throws off the DM's entire campaign, which I always advocate for. But then moving on, the other thing is the Constitution. If you want to play a wizard, a Constitution modifier is incredibly important, just because you're going to have very low health. So getting any kind of Constitution buff to most classes is really strong, but especially the lower health classes. And the rest of this doesn't seem too interesting until we get down to Menacing and Relentless Endurance. Menacing is you gain proficiency in the Intimidation skill. I find that this gives you a lot of potential to play a bard, especially, which is not something you'd associate necessarily with a half-orc, just sort of glancing over them and moving on. But, for example, College of Whispers is definitely a thing, and a half-orc College of Whispers is definitely terrifying and definitely has some influence over a crowd, to say the least. And then Relentless Endurance is when you are reduced to 0 hit points, you are not killed outright and instead drop to 1 hit point. This is strong. The only thing which limits it is the fact that it's once per long rest. I would actually say that even with that, it could be too strong. However, it also, again, means that while it would be best for fighting classes, you can use it for anything. You have that fireball spell you didn't quite get to cast before you went down. Relentless Endurance. You just cast that, bam, and then you die, of course. But you manage to get off that final shot. And really, anything you can do with it. And the final ability that's really interesting to me is Savage Attacks. When you score a critical with a melee attack, you can roll one of the weapon's damage dice 1 additional time. That's pretty good. I would say that it's a little less strong than the rest of this. However, given that the rest of it is also pretty strong, it just makes a very strong overall subrace.
And with the Relentless Endurance, the way Mara described it is the sort of sacrificial thing. You can go another way with that, which is that if your half-orc wizard finds himself surrounded by goblins or kobolds or whatever it is, you drop that fireball centered on yourself, yeah, you're going down, and then you're coming back at 1 health around a bunch of charred, crispy enemies, and meat's back on the menu, boys. Similarly with Savage Attacks, especially if you're doing something like an assassin rogue or a champion fighter or any other build that's sort of optimized to crit a lot, it can really go hard with that. I had a multi-classed half-orc assassin rogue and champion fighter. The worst thing about that character was how annoyed the rest of the table would get, because he critted so often, and it was the kind of thing where I was sitting there rolling dice and adding it up for so long that it actually stopped the flow of combat and actually created a little bit of frustration at the table. That's a good problem to have. As Mara said, Savage Attacks and all of this Relentless Endurance is all great. I have actually played a half-orc bard. I chose the College of Valor for him. Immensely fun character. I really liked the way everything gelled and came together. He was definitely a jack-of-all-trades, master of none type of character, but he was a lot of fun as that. I really like the menacing, because one of the problems in this game is that because intimidation is a charisma skill, if you're playing something like a barbarian or a paladin, paladins use their magic, so that's not the best example, a barbarian or a fighter or a wizard or just anything really powerful and dangerous that uses charisma as a dump stat, you get into the situation where you can have a negative against your ability to intimidate people, which just doesn't make any kind of sense. If you've got a gigantic fighter armed to the teeth trying to threaten someone, they should get some bonuses to that. So yeah, I mean, with both of these, you've just got so many options. You've got so much potential. And I really do hope that for 6th E, or possibly with future content for 5E, Wizards does see their way to revisit these and build them out a little bit more. Because we really just don't need any more kinds of elves. We really don't need any more kinds of tieflings. The half-orc especially, the whole deal is they're immensely common because orcs breed like rabbits, so we ought to have some variation.
Yes. Now, we hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, perhaps to consider leaving a like, maybe even subscribe if you want to see more, or leave a comment if you want to see something very specific. Now, next week we'll be talking about why companions usually suck and how to make them work.